Hi there folks, in today's demonstration I'm going to explore the two options available to us to process invoices in the Power Platform. So first up, I'll look at the low-code AI builder approach, and then I'll delve into the Document Intelligence service on Azure, and not only will I show you how to implement that in Power Automate, we'll also explore some of the costings and also fire up one of my older demos where I show you how to generate invoices that we can then pass into this invoice processing tool and extract the available entities. So this is an action-packed demo full of technical demonstrations and discussions, and so without further ado, let's jump straight into the demonstration. So I'm going to start from make.powerautomate.com. I'll then go ahead and select AI models, and it's here that I can filter by the document type models and select the pre-built invoice processing model. So this is the low-code method. This uses AI Builder credits on the Power Platform, and we can easily test this model against one of our own invoices. And if I select this file here, we can see it's analyzing an invoice that I generated earlier, which is in HTML, and it's selected some of those common entities like the customer address, customer name, the invoice date, ID, and then a table of data based on the products that have been purchased on this invoice. Now, because this is pre-built, there's nothing else for me to do. It'll extract the most common entities from an invoice document. And in order to deploy this, all I need to do is select Use Pre-Built Model and either using a flow or using an app. But of course, I'm going to deploy it to a Power Automate Cloud flow. So that opens up a brand new tab, and it's introducing a template flow, and by selecting continue, you can see that on screen I have a flow based on a manual trigger, and in this case it's asking for an input, the invoice file, and then it's using this AI builder model to extract the various properties or entities from the file content of that uploaded file. Now, of course, this could trigger when an email is received, or it could trigger when a file is uploaded to SharePoint. So very easily you could change this trigger to something else other than the manual trigger, and the rest of the flow would play out exactly as before. Then we have a create HTML table, which is using the result from that invoice, and then 3 different fields selected from the table of data that's returned by the model: the description, quantity, and amount. An action to get my profile so that we can get details like my display name and the email address of myself based on who has triggered that flow. And then finally, just a send an email action with a wee congratulations and some of the data that's been extracted from that invoice alongside the HTML table of the rows from the invoice file. So in terms of the low-code approach, it's very easy to deploy this and build a basic flow that will process invoice files and extract the various entities. Now, based on the estimate for the AI builder capacity, you buy a pack of credits. You get 1 million credits for $500, and that's assigned to your tenant, but it can equally be distributed to an environment within that tenant, so you can at least limit who can consume those credits. But once those credits have been assigned to an environment, you can spend them on all the different models that are available to us, of which the invoice processing is one of those models. And the consumption rate of invoice processing based on the Power Platform licensing guide is 32 credits per invoice page. So 1 million credits, you can see, will probably go an awful long way, and based on processing 40,000 invoices per month, you need to purchase 2 units of AI Builder credit. And then based on a calculation that I did earlier, I know that if I divide that 1 million by 32 credits, I can get approximately 31,000 invoices on that one credit. You can see there on the calculator, for $500 per month, that's 1 unit, which gives me 1 million, which ultimately gives me 31,000 invoices. But not only that, based on all the other different consumption rates for the AI Builder, I can use all of these other models too, each with their own consumption rates. Now, if I fire up the Power Platform licensing guide and jump down to AI Builder, you can see we have those tiers, the first of which is 1 capacity pack at $500 per month. That gives you the 1 million credits. And as we scroll down, you'll see there's a rate card. And if we specifically look at the invoicing model, we can see that it is 32 credits per page, which works out at approximately 1.6 cents per page. So back to our flow, if I was to save and test this, into manual mode, I'll be presented with the sign-on page because it's the first time I've run this flow. But once I've clicked continue, I can then import a file, in this case a sample invoice that I've generated earlier, and we'll see that the file content is sent to the extract information from invoices using the AI builder model. This will take approximately 20 seconds. And then before we know it, the flow is finished. And if I jump across onto my email, we can see there, congratulations, those 3 lines have been extracted at the bottom there, and we have a summary of some of the other data that has been extracted from the invoice. And if I click on the file attachment, we can see the original invoice there with the 3 order lines, the 9, 3 and 5 quantity. And if I look at the email, we can see again the 9, 3 and 5 quantity and those values extracted from the invoice. Now this has been sent to an email. Again, it could be sent to any of your third-party systems, to SharePoint, to column metadata within the SharePoint document library. There are lots of potentials here. But let's now go and have a look at the Azure Document Intelligence service. So the Document Intelligence service is part of the Azure AI services. And if we look down the left-hand side, you'll see I have Document Intelligence. And earlier today, I clicked on Create and I deployed the service to Azure. Now by doing so, you select a pricing tier. I've selected the F0, which is actually the free pricing tier, and it gives me up to 500 pages of invoices or other types for free per month. So it's definitely something that you can fire up and try out, and maybe even it works within the limits of the number of files you're processing every month. Now if I click on that service, we can then see I have keys and endpoints. So those are masked out. There's my endpoint. The endpoint is relevant when you come to build a flow or any other integration with this service. I'm going to demonstrate it with a Power Automate flow, but of course this is a pro service. You can use the REST API and connect from any application that you're building. There's also a software development kit amongst other options to integrate. As we've just spoken about pricing with the AI builder, I thought I'd quickly have a look at pricing for the pay-as-you-go options for the Document Intelligence service. And if we look at the pre-built models, which involves invoices, you'll see it's $10 for 1,000 pages. So by comparison, it works out as 1 cent per page, albeit remember, there is that 500 free pages per month if you go with the free instance. There are also paid upfront models where you can get even cheaper rates if you are processing many thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of invoices or other document types per month. But by choosing this pay-as-you-go versus the AI builder, not only are you probably saving about 40%, you're also paying only for what you're using, and you have a lot more control over the service. You do need to deploy it, but then again, you could have multiple instances and also have multiple keys, and therefore monitor who's using it and build them appropriately for their use. If I have a look at the different models that we have on that service, you'll see here there are stacks. I'm looking at the invoice model in particular, but there are all sorts of examples, contracts, health insurance cards, and as we move further down, you'll see also we can do things like extract barcodes, identify the language, etc. So this service is very powerful by comparison. It's cheaper, but as you're about to see, the integration work you need to do within Power Automate is slightly more complex than deploying a template, albeit it's still very easy to achieve. So back over onto the service, there is an Intelligence Studio. We can try it out, and that'll open up a brand new tab. And then we can see some of those different models. And if I select invoices, as before, I can browse for files and select that same invoice that I had earlier and open that into the model. I can run analysis on that. And again, we can see those various entities that have been selected from this invoice, including a table of data that contains all of those amounts, the description, product code, etc. You can also see the percentages here which relate to the confidence level of the OCR extraction. If I jump over onto the Result tab, we can see the underlying data, and this is returned to us as JSON. So unlike Power Automate and the AI builder we saw earlier, where a lot of that parsing has been done for you, you might have to spend a bit of time understanding this complex data structure in order to extract the data that you're looking for. It's also worth noting that there are analyze options here, and we can change, for instance, the page range and specify, for instance, page 1. We can also return additional data using this property for key value pairs, And there are other options to detect barcode, language, and some of the premium detection features. And if I click on save, this will add these parameters to the query string that's sent to the API. Now, if we look at the documentation for this invoice model and scroll down, we can see the area we've just explored. But in terms of the development options, there are different ways to integrate with this service. I'm specifically going to look at the REST API, and this will give us details about the endpoint that we can post, but also some example responses and how to send across your Azure subscription key for that service. And you'll see also here at the bottom we have those examples for the base64 and the document from a URL. So the thing about this service is it's asynchronous, and what that means is you'll send a request to the model and then you need to poll that endpoint and wait for the service to complete. So again, this adds a level of complexity, but I'm going to show you how to build that in Power Automate. So if I jump over into Power Automate, I'm going to use the HTTP connector today. You could potentially create a custom connector. And of course, if you're supplying keys to any of your actions, you may want to consider using the Azure Key Vault as best practice. Now, the URL is based on our individual service deployment and then a couple of parameters. So jumping back over onto Azure, if I go to keys and endpoints, I can copy that endpoint, jump back into Power Automate, paste in my URL for my service that I've deployed back into the documentation, and you'll see that after that I need the following string. And in there I have a model ID which will update shortly. So back into Power Automate, I can paste that in. I've added in 2 forward slashes here, so I'll remove one of them. And then I need to insert the model ID. Now the model ID based on documentation is the pre-built invoice. I'll copy that, jump back into my flow, and be careful to make sure that I remove those squiggly brackets, and we now have that in place. Other optional features that you might want to enable or include are these values here which you pass in the URL. So for instance, key value pairs, if you want to enable that feature, which basically provides you with an additional array of key and values based on common entities, you can jump back into the URL string, add in an ampersand, the word features, and then equals followed by key value pairs and anything else that you want to enable too. Now the method is post, because I'm going to be posting the base64 of a file to this endpoint. And then in the headers, I need to include the API key. Now again, based on documentation, you'll see that there is a header for the API key, and this is the name here, which I'll copy, jump back into Power Automate and paste. Now my key is based on one of 2 keys here. I'm going to copy this, jump back into Power Automate and paste this in. And for those that are contemplating copying it, I will have disabled this service and regenerated keys. And of course, best practices would be that you use a key vault. Now, because I'm going down the example of providing a base64 file encoding, you can see the sample body here. If I copy that, jump into Power Automate and paste that, I just need to make sure that I supply the base64 encoding of my file. But of course, at this point, I don't have a file. So if I go into the manual trigger, add in an input, request a file like we had in that earlier demo, back into my HTTP, into the body, and if we select that, including those double quotes, and we can overwrite that by looking at see more with the file content bytes. And you can see there the expression, it's trigger body file content bytes. So you need to make sure that if you're using this when a file is created, or maybe based on an attachment within an email, that you get the base64 file encoding. Now if I save this and test it, I'll select manual and test. It's asking me for a file to attach again, and I'll select that same invoice and open, and I can run that flow. And you can see that the flow completes almost instantly. But I mentioned this is an asynchronous service. So this has sent the base64 file encoding to the service with my key. There you can see the base64 with my file. And the output is a response, which is 202, basically accepting the data that I've sent, and by return sending me a link that I can follow up and check to see has that file been processed. So my next aim is to extract this operation location from the header that comes back in the output, and then use that in a polling loop, a do until, checking to see if the service is completed, and only once it's completed do I then get the response back from the Document Intelligence service. So back into Edit, What I'm going to do here is initialize a variable, and that variable is going to be used to store the current status of the service. So we'll call this status, we'll set it as a string, and I'll put in the word started, so I know that that service is started. And then I'm going to do until and loop until that service is no longer equal to started, checking to see if it's succeeded. So in the settings for do until, I'm going to insert the variable, which is the status, and check to see if it's equal to succeeded, which is all lowercase. And just to limit the number of retries, I'm going to go with a count of 5. The first action within this loop is a delay. And so if we add a delay of 10 seconds, we can delay the check of the service to see if it's completed. And then we have a 10-second delay. Then what I need is the HTTP action, because again, I'm going to use HTTP to check the endpoint that comes back from this HTTP action above to see if the service has succeeded and completed the request that I've earlier sent. So the URI for this is actually based on an expression. If I go into FX and dynamic content, I want to get the headers, and I know that when I looked at the documentation earlier, that there was an operation location, and that gives me the URL. So jumping back into Power Automate, I can put in square brackets and single quotes, operation location. Equally, I could remove the question mark and the opening and close brackets and just put a / to hit that location within the header. And I can select add. The method here is get, and then the other thing I need to include is the header key for the subscription key, and then the value based on the key that I grabbed earlier from Azure. That's that action all set up, ready to poll that endpoint after 10 seconds. Now after that 10 seconds and that HTTP call, I want to then set the variable with the outcome of that HTTP request, and the value from that is based on dynamic content, the body, and the status, not the status code, which would be 200, and it'll always be 200 unless the service is down or you've constructed the URL wrong. The status is a string based on whether it's in progress or succeeded, and I'll hit add. So now we have our do until loop. We'll send the file to the first HTTP request, which will hit the service and ask it to process based on the model that we provided, which is the invoice, the pre-built invoice service. We'll initialize a variable and set that to started, and then we will do until checking the status is equal to succeeded by implementing a delay of 10 seconds, an HTTP request to the URL that comes back from the HTTP action above, supply our API key, and then set the variable to the body status that comes back in this HTTP call. And of course, if that equals the string succeeded, then our do until will terminate. And so outside of that, what I'm going to do now is just insert a compose with the content of the body from our second HTTP call. And we'll go ahead and save and test that. So into test, I'm once more asked to select a file, and we'll go ahead and hit open, run that now. And if we watch how this flow unfolds this time, you can see the initial HTTP request, that triggers the request, we get a 202 back, we get that URL that we've passed into our loop. We have a 10-second delay. We then run our second HTTP request, which is based on that URL I've grabbed from the first one. And then we set the variable to the output, which in this case is succeeded, and our do until has terminated. If the service was having a bad day, then we'd probably see a couple of loops there based on the amount of time that it took to get a final response. If we look at the compose, we can see we have some data here. And if I look at the raw output, we have all of that lovely JSON that's come back from the service, very much like we saw in that studio. If I copy that response and jump over to this JSON beautifier and paste it in, I have the ability to view this in a tree mode. And if I click on beautify, we can now see the response. It comes back as an object, and in that object we have an analyze result, and within that, as well as having some key value pairs, which I'm going to highlight and I think is quite interesting. That's an array of data that comes back, and that calls out individual keys and values. So in this case, the payment method. And if I have a look at another one and the key, we have the invoice number. And within that individual object, there's also the value. So there's the invoice number, ICU, And within the payment method, you can see it's scored low, which means it's not been able to identify that payment method. If I have a look at one more, again, we have a key subtotal. And if I have a look at the value, we have £454.83. Based on that invoice, you can see it's £454.83 also. And I'd agree that the payment method is not very clear because at the moment I just have some variable placeholders in this file. So back over onto this beautifier, I want to expand this documents array here and the objects that are inside, and we can see we have 10 fields, and within that we have customer address amongst other things, but one of them in particular, the items object, contains an array, and within that we have 3 individual objects, and those 3 individual objects relate to the tabulated data or the array of data relevant to the individual cost, but the products as well. So you can see we have an amount, 179.91 for the first one. We have a description, which is based on a collectible coin, and we also have a product code. Again, if we look at that invoice, you can see we have our collectible coin and we have our line total. So all of this data has come across as an array in the form of our value array. So it's at this point you probably realize why we have AI Builder. It makes your life a lot easier. And if I jump back over into Power Automate and edit, I'm going to try and get those last few values of the invoice into an email. So I'm going to add in a select, and this is where you could either use a Parse JSON in order to create the dynamic values and dynamic expressions, or if you've had a good study of the JSON output, you can write your own expressions. So into the FX, we can go and select dynamic content. In this case, it's going to be based on the body from that HTTP action. And then I know that based on what we've explored, we have analyze result. We then have documents. And then after that, we had an array, and I want to get the first object, so I use the integer 0. And then I had fields, I had an items, and then I had a value array. And jumping back across onto the JSON beautifier, you can see I've highlighted the value array, which is the array of data that I want to access in order to get the values from each of these items. We can see the items object, and then within that we have a value array. After that, I would like to select the description, the quantity, and the amount, and we can see the description there, and I'd like to get the value string. We have the quantity, which is based on the value number, and the amount is based on the unit price, the value currency, and then the amount. So back over into Power Automate, I'll accept that expression, and I want to add in keys for the description, the quantity, and the amount. And when it comes to the expressions, because I'm already hitting that value array, I want to use item and then get the value object, the description, and the value string that we just saw when I explored the JSON beautifier. When it comes to the quantity, that's based on item, again open closing square brackets with single quotes, the value object, quantity, and then the value number. And then finally the amount is based on very similar item with the square brackets and single quotes, value object, amount, and value currency followed by amount. And we'll select add. Now if I then create an HTML table, we can create an HTML table with this new structure that I've created using that select, simply by selecting the output of the select. Then as a last action, if I jump back onto that original flow that I generated using a template, I'm going to copy that action here, jump back over onto my flow, paste that in, and I mustn't forget also to copy get my profile. So we'll copy that from the other flow and paste it in above. If I just check the names, remove copy, I'll do the same from here also. And because all I've done is generate a table of data, I'm actually going to remove these additional values here for now anyway, and just simply insert the output from our create HTML table, and we can go ahead and save and test this. So one last thing before I test this, if I jump over into a Canvas app that I've built and previously demoed on my YouTube channel, it shows you how we can generate invoices using a Canvas app and Power Automate. So if I put this into play, I can select a customer, in this case IT Automation, supply an invoice number which will go for ABC and then 120524, and then simply select some products and the number of each, and that'll populate a gallery, and it's that gallery that'll actually then get sent to a Power Automate flow to generate a PDF amongst various other files too. So if I click on Create Documents, that triggers a flow, and shortly I'll get an email with various attachments, and we can save that and then upload that into our model as if we were now processing the invoice rather than generating the invoice. Jumping over into my email, we now have the PDF versions that have come through. I'll select the Excel PDF version, and we can see there the 4 different lines in the invoice that's just been generated and the total, which was £549.89. If I download that file and then jump back across onto the flow, I can hit test, browse the file that I've just downloaded, and then if I run the flow, again hitting that service, looping until it's succeeded. In the compose, we can see all that data there. In the select, we can see both the input of all that data, but then the output in that new structure, which is of course based on those 4 lines from the invoice file that I've just uploaded. And then because I heard a ping, if I jump over into my email, we can see there's a congratulations email. If I click on that invoice, we can see the 4 lines based on this table here. And in fact, I didn't even notice I'd ordered the retro record player twice, 3 in total, but the model has correctly extracted those values from my invoice and sent me the follow-up email as expected. And so hopefully from that I've demonstrated how not only can you use the low-code AI builder to process invoices, you've also got the option of that professional service on Azure, using this slightly more complex technique to deploy, but maybe it's more cost effective, maybe you want to use the 500 free credits, but also remember that this flow is going to be premium, so you will need to license this flow, and maybe actually Power Automate isn't the best use case for that service, and you want to look at something like Logic Apps, or maybe one of the other development options based on the various resources that are provided in the documentation. So as always, thank you very much for watching. If you haven't already, please make sure you like and subscribe, and I look forward to seeing you again sometime soon. Cheers.